What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
Why do Catholics worship Mary?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest? Where is purgatory in the Bible?
I think the Pope has too much authority.
What's stopping you? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Well, it's that time of day where we ask the question, what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic? If you've got an answer to that question that you'd like to share with us, we would love to hear from you. If you'd like to be part of the program, the number is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're outside the United States and Canada, we've got a number for you. Your number is 1-205-271-2985. And we'll even put you straight to the front of the line if you are calling from outside North America. That's 1-205-271-2985. If you're watching us on TV today, you can be part of the program by sending us an email, ctc@ewtn.com. That's ctc@ewtn.com. You can also text us your question. Text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for a response. Text your first name and your question, message, and data rates may apply. I'm Jack Williams, sitting in today for Tom Price. Charles Beery spinning the dials, producing the program. Your call screener is Michael Birchfield, and Jeff Burson handling our social media efforts. So if you're watching us on YouTube or Facebook Live, you can type a question into the chat window, and it may find its way to us by the end of the program. And our host, as he is every day at this time, Dr. David Anders. How are you?
Jack, I'm doing fine. How about you?
You know what? I am fantastic. Thanks for asking. We've got a little objection here that was posed on the internet that we want to pose to you.
Okay, let's hear it.
That may help ease the fears of some of our viewers and listeners. The objection is this: the Catholic Church has spent 2 millennia demonizing human sexuality to a degree unmatched by any other institution, declaring the most basic, healthy, mature, and consensual behaviors taboo. Indeed, this organization still opposes the use of contraception, preferring instead that the poorest people on earth be blessed with the largest families and the shortest lives. As a consequence of this hallowed and incorrigible stupidity, the Church has condemned generations of decent people to shame and hypocrisy.
Yeah, I really appreciate that objection. I thank you. So I have a slightly different perspective, as you might suspect. The first thing I'd like to suggest is that you can't really accuse the Church of demonizing human sexuality when she elevated to the level of a sacrament the union that is specifically indicated not by Catholics but by the human race as the appropriate context for conjugal union, right? So marriage in the Catholic Church is actually a sacrament. And what affects a marriage is the agreement of a man and a woman to join together, to give oneself to one another for the purpose of raising a family through some form of sexual cooperation. And the intent to engage in that conjugal union is integral to the intent to marry. And the Church actually, among Christians, has elevated that to a sacrament, meaning that it is a sign of Christ's self-giving and self-sacrifice for the sake of his bride, the Church, and that every Christian couple has an opportunity to participate in that divine nuptial reality and to mirror it and reflect it and express it to the world through the gift of their own sexuality. So far from demonizing it, the Church has done what the Church always does, which is take a naturally good thing and elevate it through the domain of grace to something supernaturally significant. So you can hardly accuse the Church of demonizing. Now, I also think that a historical perspective here is helpful. You consider the condition of women and sexuality in the ancient world prior to the coming of Christ and after the coming of Christ. And we're all well aware in the history of feminism, scholarship has really helped us see that the condition of women in the ancient world was pretty abysmal. They were property, belonged to their husbands and fathers and sometimes their sons or whoever male was appointed as their guardian, more or less to be bought and sold at the man's discretion, so that their fertility could be at the service of the man and his progeny and his kinship and rights of inheritance and all the rest of it. Women didn't have any say in the matter. Well, along comes the Christian faith. And earliest Christians, first, second century Christians, declared that women actually, believe it or not, have the same human dignity as men, and that men ought to be held to the same standards of continence that women were held to. Because in the ancient world, men could run around and do whatever they wanted to do. Women were expected to be chaste and continent so they could protect the integrity of the patrilineal line, but men were not held to those same standards. And the pagans were kind of shocked that the Christians said, no, men have to be held to the same standard as women in terms of their sexual integrity, and women have the same rights to self-determination in the exercise of their sexuality that men do. So women can't be forced to marry against their will, for example. And the pagans said, well, that's just a crazy idea. And you Catholics are anti-life. You're the anti-life party. Because don't you know, this is the pagan attitude, if we don't get women bearing children by the age of, say, 13, 14, we're not going to be able to maintain the population. Because in those days, infant mortality was very, very high. Women might only live for 30 years. They didn't bear at least 5 kids in their lifetime. You couldn't maintain the population. Along comes the Christian church and says, no, you can't force women to do this. And we celebrate in the canon of the Mass the virgin martyrs of the early church that said we prefer to be the masters of our own sexuality, give that to Christ, and we're not going to be told what to do by you Roman patrons and you Roman men that want to exploit our bodies, right? So in a sense, the Catholic Church, really, we're the original feminists, declaring the dignity of women in their own right to self-determination. You can't force them to marry against their will. But if you do choose to marry, the Church is going to elevate that to the level of a sacrament. So I really don't think you can make the accusation that the Church demonized human sexuality. Now, in the Church's teaching on contraception, do you have any idea what contraception entailed in the first century? What this meant for women in their bodies? It's not seemly for me to say on radio. It was a horrible abuse of women in their bodies, something over which women themselves had no rights and no control. Abortion was rampant, usually through beating women until they miscarried. Women were exposed. Children were exposed if they were born and undesired, put out to die. The Church said no to all of that. Treat women with integrity. Treat their children with integrity. Treat their bodies with integrity. Far from demonizing human sexuality, the Church finally elevated it out of the morass of abuse and exploitation in which it had lived for thousands of years to something dignified.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number. It's a free phone call anywhere in North America. 833-288-3986. It's EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. We invite you to grab one of these open phone lines. The toll-free number is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. We have an email here from Brad, and he says, I've read about many hard-to-refute miracles. Why do so many of us not convert to being Catholic? I struggle with this fact that there is so much evidence, yet people don't convert.
Yeah, thanks. So, human decision-making is a complicated thing. And most of us, I think myself included, we don't frame our worldview and our belief system simply based on sort of an aggregate of available facts. That's just not the way we roll. At any given moment, we're bombarded with so many facts we can't possibly take them all in. And we usually organize our perceptions and what we think about the universe in ways that may be non-rational. Typically, we're motivated by all kinds of non-rational concerns, things of which we may not be even aware. And Cardinal Newman, who was a great Catholic theologian of the 19th century, St. John Henry Cardinal Newman, understood this. And when he talked about the act of faith and divine revelation, he really emphasized that more than syllogistic proof is necessary to bring people to the point of making an act of faith. That there really needs to be a kind of coherence between their whole life and personal narrative in the context of their moral decision-making, such that the presentation of the faith is not only credible but attractive and plausible to them. He called that the illative sense of the faith. It's kind of an infelicitous word, but that's what he meant by it. And in my own experience, I find as an apologist that sometimes you can present a really beautiful argument for the truth of the Catholic faith, and in fact, you may rhetorically just demolish the guy you're talking to, at the end of which he may conclude, well, that was a pretty argument, Anders. And I'm going to go off to my pagan meeting now. Thank you very much. I remember one time, actually, I before I was a Catholic, but I was still sort of being apologist for the Christian faith, I constructed what I thought was a magnificent argument for the reliability of the New Testament documents. And my interlocutor had absolutely no response whatsoever at all to my arguments. And when I concluded, I don't know what I thought. He was going to throw up his hands and say, "Praise Jesus." I'm not sure what I was expecting. And his response to me was, "Yeah, but I don't like Christians." And I thought, okay, that's a whole nother can of worms we've got to deal with.
833-288-EWTN. That's our toll-free number. It's a free phone call anywhere in North America. 833-288-3986. Evangeline writes in, I felt drawn to the Catholic Church for years, but I'm still scared. Everyone in my life, my parents, pastor, and friends, tells me that the Catholic Church is untrustworthy. I've struggled for years with trying to interpret both Scripture and the history of the Church for myself, and it has only resulted in a boatload of inner turmoil and near paralysis when it comes to ministry to others. But how do I know that it's safe to let go and trust the Church?
Yeah, what a great question. So it really boils down to the credibility of divine revelation. And we touched on this a little bit in the last call. The Church actually says that the act of faith requires more than just syllogistic proof, right? And there are certain things about the faith, say, for example, the dogma of the Trinity, that we can never independently, rationally verify. We have to trust divine revelation, which means the teaching of the Church, to believe the doctrine of the Trinity. So is the authority that commands the act of faith, is it credible? Is it worthy of belief? And an analogy would be, my wife might tell me things that I can't independently verify. For example, what if she calls up and says, I've had a flat tire, and I'm sitting on the side of Interstate 65, and I need you to come pick me up? Well, I can't independently verify the truth of that statement before I've made a decision whether or not to comply with her request. So I've got to make a decision about whether to actually comply based simply on the credibility of her witness. Is she a reliable witness? And that's not the sort of thing that I could have sort of mathematical certainty about it, but I can have a moral certainty based on my familiarity with her over the years. And we're sort of in an analogous situation with the revelation of the Catholic faith and with the divine authority of the Catholic Church. What is the credibility of the Church's claims down through the centuries? Has the Church, in fact, fulfilled its job description? Has it kept the integrity of the faith? Has it produced saints and sanctity? Has it been salt and light in the world and had an overall benevolent influence on human civilization? And I think we can answer all those questions positively. Earlier, someone asked about the witness of miracles. We can bring those in as well. So all of these evidences come as sort of converging, coherent arguments for the credibility of the Catholic faith. But then the decision to make the act of faith is, in a sense, a pragmatic one, because we have so much to gain by believing the Catholic faith, ultimately our salvation and our conformity to Christ. So there you go. And the Church, Christ is going to call you to make the decision to follow him. Just like the rich young ruler that came to him and said, what must I do to be saved? He wanted a formula. Christ refuses to give him a formula. He gives him an invitation. Come and follow me.
Michelle writes in, Dr. Anders, since the Church declared Galileo a heretic, but of course was proven wrong in the end, how are we to defend the infallibility of the Magisterium to those who use this incident as proof that the Church gets it wrong?
Okay, thanks. So the Galileo Affair is one of the most misunderstood episodes in Church history. Now, to be clear, the position of the Church with regard to natural science and natural philosophy has always been that the doctrine of the unity of reason and faith, so that if something is true in natural philosophy or science, it cannot be contradicted by an article of Catholic faith. It will not be, because the same God that wrote the Bible wrote the natural world, and he's not going to be at odds with himself. If we think there's a contradiction between natural science and revelation, then we've made a mistake someplace in our reasoning. And we don't prejudge the error. We don't assume that the error was on the side of the natural scientist. Might have been on the part of the theologian. And this is exactly the way the church operated in the Galileo Affair. So Galileo, of course, following up on Copernicus, proposed a heliocentric cosmology, but he had no immediate empirical evidence for that claim. He had demonstrated it empirically. He had some nice numbers. He had some nice theories that made sense of the observable data, but he couldn't actually prove the reality. Not for about another 100 years do we have the technology to do that. And he brings this information to the Holy See, Cardinal Bellarmine, and what the cardinal said was this. He says, Galileo, your math works. The math works. I concede that you have captured the phenomena in a formula, right? But I'm not persuaded that you've proved the physical reality. You've given me a formula that can predict the motion of the planets, but your theory about their organization, I'm not sure you've demonstrated that. So I'm going to hold off on affirming your theory, all right? But here's what we'll do. If you can prove the theory empirically, then we will adjust our interpretation of the Genesis account accordingly. It's like, I think you're wrong. That was his attitude. I think you're wrong. I think divine revelation suggests a geocentric worldview. But if you can prove otherwise, then obviously we've made a mistake in the way we're reading the Bible, and we'll go back and we'll revisit our biblical interpretation so that it accords with the empirical data, okay? And Urban VIII, Pope Urban VIII, had the exact same attitude, right? Now, the interesting thing is, Urban VIII's attitude about Galileo, that you've got a theory that captures the phenomena, but doesn't necessarily penetrate to the essence of to the physical reality. There's a modern theory in physics that corresponds to that. It's Niels Bohr's theory of the atom, right? That we never really penetrate to the essence. We just have a sort of instrumental knowledge of the abstract patterns that we can observe, right? And we're kind of agnostic on the inner essence of the thing. David Mermin, a theoretical physicist, was once asked, "Well, what is the stuff?" And his response was, "Well, just shut up and calculate. Like we can't go there." So Urban VIII's attitude, this sort of instrumental view of scientific epistemology, is actually fairly forward-looking. It's a very modern way of thinking about science and philosophy. And of course, what Galileo got in trouble for was not proposing a heliocentric worldview, but insisting that it was an empirical fact. Right, which had not yet actually been demonstrated scientifically. So he wasn't condemned as a heretic for teaching something that was contrary to sacred scripture. He was actually in trouble for disobeying not level his belief, but his behavior. That he was told, don't go out and teach this as a physical fact until it can be empirically confirmed, because it'll be very socially destabilizing, right? The world might lose faith in divine revelation, or they might not know what to do with this. So just teach it as a hypothesis for the time being. Well, he didn't do that, right? So he got in trouble. Now, in retrospect, I think we can all admit it would have been better off if the church hadn't taken that disciplinary action. But nothing in the doctrine of infallibility is really at stake in this question. And the church did a wiser job than they're given credit for.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. Kathy is in Huron, Ohio. She's listening on Annunciation Radio. Kathy, thanks for holding. You're on with Dr. David Anders.
Hi there. Thank you. I am Catholic. I have a friend who was Catholic, and one of the reasons he is not Catholic is because he doesn't believe in the Deuterocanonicals, the Apocrypha, because, he says, Jesus or Paul do not speak of or mention any of those books in the New Testament, but they do speak of the non-Deuterocanonicals in the New Testament. And I looked up and I saw where Protestant authors, it says, listed 340 places where the New Testament cites the Septuagint, but only 33 places where it cites from the Hebrew canon rather than the Septuagint. And I know the Septuagint had the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonicals in it. What do you know? Are the Deuterocanonicals quoted in the New Testament by either Jesus or Paul?
They're alluded to many times. They're alluded to many, many times. And you can just, any internet search for New Testament citations of the Deuterocanonicals will give you hundreds of allusions. Now, this question is interesting and nuanced. There's several facets to it. So the most important question, the single most important question we have to ask about the biblical canon, whether the Old Testament canon or the New Testament canon, is this: how do we know what the canon is? That's the most important question. Now, your friend has proposed a rule. He's proposed a theory. If the New Testament cites it, then it's canonical. That's his theory. Well, the New Testament does not cite all of the Hebrew texts in the Hebrew canon, let alone the Deuterocanonical texts. So you're going to have to throw out a lot of the Hebrew Bible based on that rule. Here's another thing the New Testament doesn't cite: the New Testament. The New Testament books don't give us a comprehensive list or citations from the other New Testament books. You're not going to get a citation from Matthew and John. You're not going to get a citation of Peter by Paul. You see my point, right? So that can't be how we know what the canon is. Now, there's really only one objective rule that can define the canon for us, and that is if there is some extra canonical authority, something outside the canon itself that possesses divine authority that can define the canon. Otherwise, the canon could never be an article of faith. And Protestants put it forth as an article of faith. You pick up the Westminster Confession of Faith, Presbyterian Confession of Faith, it lists the canon. So here's what we think the canon is. Here are the books. Boom, 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 boom. All right. They put it forth as an article of faith. Well, if it's an article of faith, it has to have divine authority as a list. There's only one institution that has the authority to define a canon of the Bible, and that's the Magisterium of the Catholic Church, because Christ gave it, deputized it with that authority. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. If you throw out the authority of the Catholic Church, you've got to throw out the idea of a biblical canon. You've got to throw it out. Now, when it comes to citations of the Deuterocanonical texts, there are many citations and many more allusions of the Deuterocanonical text. The Book of Wisdom is all over Paul's letter to the Romans, for example, and you come up with many other references. Book of Revelation, chapter 5, makes a very overt allusion to Tobit, chapter 12. Book of Hebrews, when it enumerates those who are models for us in the life of faith, references the Deuterocanonical text as well. I mean, you can look up the citations for yourself. And to your point, not only does the New Testament cite the Deuterocanonicals specifically, but in about 95% of the cases when it cites the Old Testament, it cites the Septuagint, which contained the Deuterocanonical texts. And when the Church Fathers, who understood that there was both a Hebrew and a Greek canon of the Old Testament, when they deal with this question and they ask explicitly, should we advert to the Hebrew canon or the Greek canon of the Old Testament? And Augustine does this, for example, in his book on Christian doctrine. They say, well, explicitly, we should advert to the Greek canon, not the Hebrew, because the Greek one is the ecclesiastical canon. It's the canon of the apostles.
And I think you've quoted many times, I believe, a Protestant scholar that you're somewhat fond of, who acknowledges that there's no real logical way to assert anything other than the Catholic Church establishing the canon of Scripture.
Sure. You know, I remember I had a debate one time. It was a kind of ad hoc debate. I got invited to a dinner party, and by a Catholic family whose next door neighbor had brought their ringer. You know, their Baptist pastor over, and the guy had a PhD in patristics. I mean, he was a knowledgeable fellow. And I said, well, let's just have barbecue and just talk, you know, and have a nice time. And they say, fine. Well, in the middle of dinner, this guy pulls out a notebook, and he's like, you know, licks his fingers, like, let's get going. And he begins about a 15-minute lecture on the authority of the Deuterocanonical text. And he's citing from Theodore of Mopsuestia and all these early church councils, and he's making this big historical argument about which fathers did and didn't acknowledge these particular books as canonical. And he's very erudite. I mean, he knows more about the patristics than I do. And he got done, and I said, well, let me ask you one question. He says, what's that? I said, is this an article of faith? And he says, well, yeah, it has to be, because you have to have certainty. I said, okay, who has authority to define an article of faith? Erudition apart, you know, that's the only question that really matters.
That's right. Straight ahead, we'll talk to Tom, Andrea, Julie, and hopefully we'll talk to you. It's EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. 833-288-EWTN. That's our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. Next up is Andrea in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, listening on KMMK Radio. Andrea, you are on with Dr. David Anders.
Hi. My question is about terminology. Can we use words like metaphysical and supernatural when we're talking about divine Catholic realities?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So the church has a pretty specified vocabulary going back for thousands of years, and so you can use these words. If you use them, people that you speak to, if they're educated Catholics, are going to have a very particular understanding of what they mean. So I think it's important to know how they're used in a Catholic context. So metaphysics is a branch of philosophy. So we don't usually use the word metaphysical to refer to the supernatural necessarily. It's a branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of being, right? So what's the structure of reality like? Things like, causation and change and substance and these sort of categories of being that would apply to anything that exists. Dogs, cats, astronauts, and astrophysics. All those would fall within the scope of metaphysics as it examines the nature of being as such. And Catholics are very interested in metaphysics because we think that the science of metaphysics, the philosophy of metaphysics, can ultimately lead us to God and also to truths about the moral life and the human person. So it's an important category in Catholic thinking. Now, the word supernatural means something that is above nature, all right? And it's different in Catholic usage from the word miracle. Right, and a lot of people use the word supernatural and miracle in the same sense. Well, they're not the same in Catholic vocabulary, even though some Catholics themselves get that confused. A miracle is a visible or sensible wonder, something that can be perceived by the senses, for which no natural explanation can be provided. For example, the premier miracle in Catholic history is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. We have no natural way to explain how a dead body could come back to life and ascend into heaven. That's a miracle. It's visible, right? Supernatural is something that transcends nature, but it may not be visible to the eye. And an example would be the domain of sanctifying grace in the soul. This is a supernatural quality that's infused into the soul, making us like God, fitting us for heaven. But you can't sense it. You can't feel it. You can't taste it or see it or smell it or touch it. You can participate in it, but you can't actually sense it. So we'd call that supernatural, but not technically a miracle because it's not sensible. And all of these words are used in Catholic theology and Catholic philosophy.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. Next stop, Fredericksburg, Virginia. Tom is a first-time caller, listening on Sirius XM Channel 130. Tom, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Dr. Anders. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you in a great show. We really gain a lot of insight from it. So my question is regarding the prayer, the Our Father, and the part where we ask Our Father to lead us not into temptation. It seems a bit odd that our Father would be inclined to lead us to temptation. Just wonder if we're suffering from a little bit of a translation challenge there. I'll hang up and listen on the radio. Thanks.
Yes, I really appreciate the question. Now, interestingly, it's not a translation error at all. It says what it means, and it means what it says. Now, there is a movement afoot in some segments of the Catholic world to tone this word down because it's a difficult word. And, we can't have God leading us into temptation. That just seems to implicate God in evil. We can't be thinking that way. Maybe we should get rid of this word and use some other word. And I'm not a fan of that movement because Jesus said what he meant. He meant what he said. The word in Greek is eisphero, and it's only used a few times in the New Testament. It's the very same word that is used in the account of the paralytic when the men brought the paralytic to Jesus and they carried him in and placed him, through the roof at the foot of Jesus, and Jesus heals the guy and he gets up and takes his mat and goes home, right? They were carting him into the presence of Jesus. That's the sense of lead here. It's a very strong word. I mean, picking Jack up from one place, putting Jack down in another place. That's a pretty strong word. Now,
Good luck,
does God ever lead anybody into temptation? Well, let's see what the Holy Scriptures say about this. In Matthew Matthew chapter 4, verse 1, we read, "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil, in order that he might be tempted by the devil." So the Spirit of God intended that Christ be tempted by the devil. Intended that he be tempted. Now, he knew he wouldn't sin. He didn't intend for Christ to sin. Of course, Christ did not sin. But he did intend for him to be tempted. So how do we make sense of this? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas, in his commentary on the Lord's Prayer, gives 3 reasons why God would lead us into temptation. Number 1, to strengthen us in virtue.
I like that.
No pain, no gain. Right? You grow in virtue by practice, right? You strain against what's difficult or arduous, and you strengthen those virtuous muscles. So one would be to strengthen us in virtue, all right, or to test us in virtue. Same thing. Another one would be to give us the opportunity to acquire merit before God. Because if you resist temptation, you do the arduous good, that's meritorious. I remember one time I went to confession, and I said to the priest, "Well, I'm really struggling with this temptation." He said, "Well, did you do it?" I said, "No, I just want to." And he said, "Oh, well, then that's meritorious." You know, I was all kind of down on myself. I'm a bad guy because I'm tempted to do this bad thing. He says, "No, you're not a bad guy at all. You're a human guy, and the fact that you're not doing the bad thing means you're actually acquiring merit before God," right? So what a revelation. What a delight, too. You know, in the Catholic view of things, concupiscence, which is the immoderate desire for bodily pleasure or something like that, concupiscence and all the other sort of roots of wounds of sin are not themselves sins. They're occasions of sin. But if you resist them, you actually acquire merit before God, and then that's praiseworthy. So that's another reason God might lead you into sin. A third reason would be as a scourge or punishment for your actual sins, right? Because sometimes the punishment of sin is more sin. Sin is nothing other than an irrational act. Is nothing more or less than an irrational act. St. Thomas Aquinas says virtue is life according to the rule of reason, and sin is deflecting from the rule of reason. What is the reasonable good? When you don't do the reasonable good, that's sin. Now, why is it the reasonable good? Because it affords our flourishing, right? It helps us to be healthy, happy, holy, live flourishing, good human lives. That's what virtue does for us. When we don't do that, we suffer. It's like hitting yourself in the head with a hammer. What's the punishment for hitting yourself in the head with a hammer? You've hit yourself in the head with a hammer, right? So sometimes the punishment of sin is in fact more sin. Right? So for those 3 reasons, God would in fact lead us into temptation. Now, God never intends that we sin. And God does not directly cause evil. But he will put us in situations where we have to confront evil, even as he does his only beloved Son.
833-288-EWTN. We've got a couple open phone lines for you at 833-288-3986. Next stop is Central Valley, California. Julie is another first-time caller. She's watching us on Facebook Live today. Julie, thanks so much for holding. Welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. This is a question that has been haunting me for a while. I'm a cradle-to-grave Catholic. We've been Catholic since St. Patrick was a gleam in his mother's eye. And recently I'm doubting my choices, and I have 2 questions. The first is, I was raised to believe and had heard many times that Catholicism is inclusive, and it is always written with a small c to show that we are welcoming to all. And I was also raised to believe that there are many paths to God. We have chose Catholicism, but others may choose a different path, and they are not wrong. This is our path that we believe in, but we welcome all. Recently, I've been told that I was misinformed as a young Catholic, and I was due to Vatican II, the teachings were completely incorrect, and there is only one faith, and it is only Catholic, and the rest of the people that I love that are not Catholic cannot experience an afterlife.
Okay.
This concerns my first question.
Yeah, so I think that you have been misinformed in many ways, because what you have proposed to me is a false dichotomy, right? You've presented me with two options, and you've said, well, it's either A or B. Well, I don't think either one of those captures the fullness of the Catholic position. All right. Your main concern is, are my non-Catholic friends condemned to hell? And I'll give you the short answer to that question. The short answer to that question is no, not necessarily, right? So just because someone is not a card-carrying Catholic does not mean that they are ipso facto condemned to hell. That's false. So if anybody has told you that repeatedly, the Church has rejected that opinion. It is not absolutely necessary to be a card-carrying Catholic in order to get into heaven. So that's wrong, okay? You're misinformed about that. On the other hand, we are not relativists or indifferent to the question of religious faith or practice. So, Catholicism is not, say, one flavor of ice cream, and all the other religions are just another flavor of ice cream, and whatever flavor of ice cream you like is fine for you. That's not true either, right? Otherwise, there wouldn't have been any reason for Christ to come, to be incarnate, and to be crucified and die and rise again from the dead. If Moses had been sufficient, if Confucius had been sufficient, if Buddha had been sufficient, then there would have been no point in the revelation of Jesus and the missionary call to the entire world, right? So there's something unique about Christ. So let's kind of spell this out for us a little bit. Now, to begin with, I'd like to just dispel right away the idea that all religions are fundamentally the same. And I think it can be seen quite easily. And all you have to do is consider most of the religions of the Bronze Age. Most of the religions of the Bronze Age. So, for example, if you go to Carthaginian religion, which is basically Phoenician, before the Christian era, we can find large archaeological digs that contain the burned bones of infant children that were sacrificed to Baal, right, to the Phoenician god. And I think you would probably agree with me that you would not think that a religion that sacrifices children by burning them to death in honor of a pagan deity is on a par with Christ's message of love and self-sacrifice, right? Human sacrifice of that kind is not fundamentally the same religion that Jesus teaches us to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And similarly, the Aztec cult, the priestly cult of the Aztecs, was an imperialistic, colonialist cult that conquered other nations in order that they could take slaves and cut their hearts out and feed them to the sun god. And then their bodies were cannibalized by the Aztec priests and their families, and their skins were made into clothing and things of that sort. So I don't think anybody would contend that the religion of Jesus, or even the religion of Moses for that matter, is fundamentally the same as the Aztec cannibalistic human sacrifice cult, right? They're not fundamentally the same, very different. And many of the Bronze Age religions around the world had this level of barbarism in them, okay? Now, it's a little bit different when we get into the religions of the Axial Age. You begin to move in human history, say period 800 BC to say 300 BC, you begin to find a more humanizing influence in some of the major religions of India, China, the Hellenistic era, and the Hebrew people, and more of an emphasis on, say, changing my behavior rather than killing my neighbor. And the Church's position on these religions is, to the extent to which they begin to approach the love of God and neighbor as the highest moral goods of the human person, well, to that extent, they're sort of mirroring the truth of the Catholic faith. And the Church Fathers, early Christian theologians, when they looked at these axial age religions, especially they were very fond of Greek philosophy like Plato and Aristotle, Socrates, when they looked at those religions, they saw intimations, hints, they thought, of what would eventually be made more manifest in Christ. And they had a very optimistic attitude towards those religions and those philosophers. So Justin Martyr, who was a 2nd century Christian theologian, considered Socrates, for example, to be a sort of Christian before Christ, because he believed Socrates was inspired by the same divine logos, the same divine word who had become incarnate in Jesus. So he had a very optimistic attitude towards them. And so the way the church understands this today, and this you do find in the Second Vatican Council, is the fullness of divine truth, divine revelation, the truth of the love of God and neighbor and all the means of grace has been made present to us in Christ, in the church that he founded, which is the Catholic Church. But there are, to be sure, other religious traditions that have elements of that truth and sanctification. And the people, the participants in those religious traditions, by laying hold of those elements of Catholic truth in their own traditions, may find in them means of sanctification and redemption. And so it's not simply that you have to be Catholic, but neither is it true that all religions are fundamentally the same. No, there is a truth about God. God is love. He calls us in his likeness and image to mirror and imitate that love, to seek forgiveness, to seek healing, and to love God and love neighbor. Right? That's the way of salvation. The Catholic faith manifests that fully and has witnessed that to history, to the profound benefit of humankind down through the centuries. But to the extent to which other traditions also can lay hold of that truth, even in an inchoate manner, then an opportunity is afforded to them as well to participate in the grace of God.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. Plenty of time for your phone calls. July means a couple of new offerings from EWTN Publishing. Living the Scriptures. It's a collection of some of Mother Angelica's best on-air presentations and some of her extemporaneous meditations. You'll discover that Scripture is not a complicated puzzle that's meant for scholars, but it's a divine guide for our everyday spiritual life. And also, the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. The Grand Master of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem, Cardinal Fernando Filoni, he reflects on the life and beliefs and values and the choices that the members of that order, the Knights and Dames of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre, learn as part of that group. Again, Living the Scriptures, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. And I'm guessing that title rolls off the tongue a little better in either Latin or Italian or however it was written. But you can find both of those now at EWTN's religious catalog. That's EWTNRC.com. Buy Catholic, shop EWTNRC.com. Next stop for us is Newport, Rhode Island. Anthony is in Rhode Island, listening at EWTN.com. Anthony, you're on with Dr. Anders.
Doctor, thank you so much for taking my call. I appreciate it. In all due respect, what is the official church position vis-a-vis some of the horrific acts that have been perpetrated in terms of heretics, burning at the stake, fearsome, horrific? It seems to contradict everything that we hold dear. And I'm just wondering, has the church officially condemned those acts, and what is the position presently?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the question. So John Paul II was very explicit in his pontificate that he would personally apologize for the sins of Catholics down through the centuries, and acknowledging that Catholics had done, both individually and collectively, have done horrific things in human history, and he apologized for the sins of Catholics. And I don't believe the Church has ever taken the position that Catholics, either individually or collectively, were not capable of committing grave sins. On the contrary, this is sort of integral to our religious doctrine, that humans are sinful, wounded, fallible creatures that can do awful things. Is why we stand in need of redemption, right? And so that's the position. That's the position. Now, at any given point in time, it can be obscure what reason the natural law and the law of charity demand in prudent decision making, right? And so there are times we may get wrapped up in a kind of political ideology or a theory of social organization that's dehumanizing and would seem to justify horrific activity. And it can be maybe hard to see that in the moment. And then a generation later, you look back and go, oh, my goodness, that was a dumb thing to do, right? And we're all still guilty of this today. We do it all the time, right? And you just think about how many times in history the Pope has said, well, don't do this thing, it's terrible, like don't enslave the indigenous peoples, or don't conduct transatlantic slavery, don't do these things. Pope's calling out, don't do these things, don't do these things. And yet Catholics disobey the Pope, and they run off and enslave indigenous people and engage in transatlantic slavery, and they have some ideological justification that based on spurious theories of race or whatever it might be, but the real motive is they want to line their pockets with gold, and so they come up with a convenient reason to disobey the Pope. Well, this still happens today. The Pope stands up and says, don't kill babies. Read my lips. Do not kill babies. Don't kill them. No baby killing. We are against killing babies. You cannot do it. And what do Catholics today do? Some of them, well, he's old-fashioned and he lives in Rome and he doesn't understand women and he doesn't understand the economics of the thing and they come up with some ideological justification to kill babies, right? And we've been doing it for 2,000 years. But the fact of the matter is for 2,000 years, the Church has been teaching the dignity of the human person, has been teaching that the profit motive corrupts, right? Has been teaching, blessed are the poor. Church has been teaching these principles for 2,000 years. And but individual Catholics, even collectively Catholics, may be more or less deaf to that message as their own selfish motives so incline them.
We head next to St. Clairsville, Ohio. Gene is a first-time caller listening on Light of Life Radio. Gene, you're on with Father, how am I doing? I just ordained you. Dr. David Anders.
Hello, Dr. David.
Hi, how can I help you?
I was listening to your discussion about the Our Father, and my question is, who do we refer to as the great tempter?
The tempter would be the devil.
That's my opinion also, is that if there's temptation happening, most of it is from the devil, and that's who leads us astray. And why would Jesus put something in the Our Father that would be a very rare temptation?
Okay, thanks. So I really appreciate the question. What Jesus prays in the Our Father is that God not lead us into temptation, right? He doesn't pray, God don't tempt us. See, that would be very contradictory. The prayer is not, God don't tempt me. The prayer is, God don't lead me into temptation. Now, we know that sometimes happens, right? Because I quoted earlier in the show, Matthew chapter 4, verse 1, the Spirit of God led Christ into the desert so that the devil might tempt him. Now, the devil was doing the tempting, but the Spirit of God moved Christ into the circumstance where he would be exposed to that so that Christ could acquire merit. It's meritorious that Jesus resisted that temptation. It's how he merited salvation for us, in fact. His whole life was meritorious for our sake. It also gives us an example to follow. In all these ways, he redeems us by exposing himself to temptation. Now, or letting himself be exposed to temptation. Does the Spirit of God ever cause us to be exposed to temptation? Well, we're all tempted by the devil, and God is in control of all of human history down to every sparrow that falls from the sky. And so it clearly falls within the permissive will of God that we should be exposed to temptation. Why? Well, so that we might also, like Christ, have the opportunity to acquire merit, so that we might grow in virtue by resisting temptation, maybe perhaps as a scourge, as a punishment for our sins. But it's not God who's doing the tempting. It's the devil who's doing the tempting.
Kim is watching us on YouTube, and she says she's a Protestant in the process of converting, and her husband's pushing back, by, especially against the Eucharist, by saying, if Jesus meant this as literal, why don't we take his other words literal, like, if your hand offends you, cut it off?
Great question. So in a nutshell, how do we understand any passage of Scripture? How do we interpret any passage of Scripture? Because I could arbitrarily say of any text, well, that's not literal. I could pick anyone at random and say, that's not literal. I just assert that this is some metaphorical or allegorical interpretation that means that, like burritos from heaven are going to fall or something. I could just assert that. And how would you disabuse me? How would you disprove me? Well, this is why we need an interpretive authority. And the truth about the Eucharist is, I think there are contextual reasons to take him seriously, but more to the point, even from the first century, the church has always understood these words in, literal is not the word I'd use, realistic. It's the true presence of Christ that's indicated. This has always been the way the church has understood the text. The doctrine of the Eucharist precedes the gospel narratives. The church already had the practice of worshiping the body and blood of Christ in the Holy Eucharist before the text of the gospel was even written. These texts were written in and for and by the community that gave us the Orthodox understanding of the Eucharist.
On behalf of our host, Dr. David Anders, our producer, Charles Beery, our call screener, Michael Birchfield, and our social media maven, Mr. Jeff Burson, I'm Jack Williams, again sitting in today for Tom Price here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Check us out every day, Monday through Friday, 2 o'clock Eastern Time, right here on EWTN Radio. God bless.